I first want to start by thanking everyone for being here today, and as well as the society for organizing this event. So, oops. So before I get into my presentation, I first kind of want to help everyone understand how we ended up where we are today. And to do that, we kind of have to go back about 2 years ago to November 2023, as Fiona mentioned, when they had the first scoping and planning meeting for the next iteration of the physical activity surveillance that would be occurring at the end of this decade. And within this document, there's a lot of nice information that contains and outlines many of the inherent limitations of self-report that most of us and all of us probably are all very well aware of. However, within the document, they also highlight that there's an increasing use of wearable devices to measure activity in large-scale epidemiological studies on activity and health, therefore making it much more feasible to move away from self-report and more towards device-based measurements. However, it was also noted that there's a current lack of scientific agreement on key device characteristics, data processing, and reporting protocols. And if we're going to make the transition from self-report to device-based measures, these key characteristics and data processing protocols needed to be addressed, and they need to be addressed quite soon as we're quickly approaching the end of the decade. And then this led us to earlier this year in June for 2.5 days in Montreal, where a group of us got together to have discussions on what this fit for purpose device needed to be able to do, what its specifications needed to be in order to accurately measure movement or activity and sedentary behavior. And from this, we began our 2.5 day conversation where we were sequestered away and had very methodical and systematic approaches on different aspects that we would be discussing. And so much so that the conversations carried over beyond these 2.5 days offline via email and continue even as we are here today discussing. So right off the bat, when we first began the meeting, we knew right away where the wear placement would be, and that would be on the wrist. And this was partly informed by open discussions that were had throughout 2024 at activity conferences and symposiums and seminars such as this, where feedback was gathered from the research community on what would be the most appropriate and applicable wear placement for such device data collection. And this is largely informed on the why. Why are we deciding to use the wrist, and why did the community dictate this would be the most appropriate? Well, we know that the wrist has high acceptance and compliance. Large numbers of people are now wearing monitoring devices on their wrists, such as smartwatches, and that is the most popular wear location. And it's becoming increasingly familiar among the general population and aligns with what people are already using and seeing in their daily lives. We also knew that the wrist placement was also suitable for a wide range of populations, and we also noted that wrist-worn devices are suitable for older adults and people with different movement patterns or functions if data processing was required. And it's also known that the wrist also holds potential to be future-proof in that if capacity became appropriate in the future, other health metrics could be gathered beyond just simply movement. So that was the why. Now we needed to know the what this device would look like, what exactly this device would do. And in order to answer the what, we had to first address the how. How is this device going to be put together? What components are going to be inside this device to do what it needs to do? And for this, there are several key discussion topics that needed to be had. And within each of these discussion topics, there are subtopics and further conversations. And as you can imagine, as you get into it, you can get quite lost in the weeds. But luckily, we had Fiona and Kareem Khan there to guide us and keep us on track and focused in the 2.5 days we had together. So once again, wear placement, that was an easy tick, that box is done. Now we could focus our attention and time on the different wear protocols, what protocols we'd use, issues related to device properties and specifications, and then other issues related to device processing protocols. And these bottom three categories is what I'll be going into more detail here with us today. So we're saying we're using the wrist placement, and some of you may be saying, well, the job is done for you. The conversations can be quick because there's already a lot of devices, both research grade and consumer grade, that can do what you need it to do, which is measure activity and movement. However, there's a big gap between the cost of a research grade and consumer grade device and the cost that we were working with to create this fit-for-purpose device that can be manufactured and distributed at scale across all different member states. And therefore, we had to create a cost-effective device while still maintaining durability, good quality, and accuracy in measuring that movement. So now for the wear protocols. We're using the wrist, but we had to have conversations on, are we going to use the dominant or non-dominant wrist? And on day one, this was one of the shorter conversations we had, as it was decided that we'd be using the non-dominant wrist for the wear placement, as this was the most practical and acceptable placement for use in population monitoring systems. However, on day two, other conversations were had that, well, across member states and across different populations, maybe some people don't want to use their non-dominant wrist and they prefer to use their dominant wrist. This now creates heterogeneity in the data collection protocols. Therefore, it was recommended that each participant record the wear location on whether they use a non-dominant or dominant, so this could be handled in data post-processing. But then we also realized the algorithm we used and the processing we used had to be invariant to wrist placement. And on these conversations, we realized that what's available in the literature and what it has shown is that the movement patterns from non-dominant and dominant wrist aren't too different from each other compared to just looking at the acceleration magnitude. So we felt pretty safe that using a non-dominant was good, and if someone chose a dominant, this would have minimal effect on the outcomes we'd be looking at. Next was the number of wear days we'd be recommended at a minimum to use. And as Fiona mentioned in her presentation, for this, we went with a 7-day protocol. This is both consistent with usual practice and the global activity guidelines over the past 20 years. However, we also realized we want to keep it open to member states to make their own decisions if they want to collect more data. So we also left that open for them to use as well if they want to go beyond 7 days, with the conversations being left open that as more national data becomes collected from different countries and different experiences are gathered and collected, it may be possible to review, update, and adapt this protocol in the future. Moving now to the next two topics we discussed was wear time and device orientation. So for wear time, we would go with our standard 7 days per 7 days and 24 hours across the day, realizing this could allow us to capture all different types of movement, whether it be activity, sedentary time, or sleep. However, for this meeting and our conversations, we were strictly focused on activity and sedentary time, therefore sleep could go out the window. Now, if we're only interested in activity and sedentary time, do we really need the full 24-hour days for it to be a valid wear day? And this led down other avenues of further conversations. What would the minimum wear time be within a day to be considered a valid day? Would it be just the waking time of 10 hours or 18 hours? And for this, we didn't come to a definitive conclusion across our 2.5 days, and this one was still open up for discussion and conversations. Next, going over to our device orientation. So typically you would have, say, for example, 3-axis accelerometer with the y-axis in the vertical position. We could recommend that. However, we do realize that there's sometimes user error, putting the device on in the wrong placement, and you may end up with the y-axis in the vertical, or in other bizarre scenarios, you could even end up with the z-axis in the vertical. And therefore, to account for potential end user errors in device placement and orientation, we realized that the algorithm and processing would have to either be invariant to different orientations of the device, or the post-processing should be able to correct for the device orientation and get the correct alignment. So we concluded that device orientation could be in any orientation that the device was used on, and the algorithm would be robust enough to handle that. Moving on now to the next topic of conversations that we had around device properties and specifications. So for this one, I found these to be the most interesting conversations because whatever we dictated for one item within the device would influence conversations we had later on in the afternoon and would also dictate decisions we'd have to make the next day. And for many of you, I assume you didn't think you'd be coming here looking at an algebraic equation. And if this seems a little esoteric to you, you're probably correct because it is a quite esoteric example I'm giving you. So let's give you something more tangible on what we actually did across these days. So we had to have conversations around the device acceleration range or the dynamic range. And we also had a conversation around resolution and sensitivity. Coming into this, we knew what we wanted our sensitivity to be, or our minimum detectable range. And we also knew that we wanted our acceleration dynamic range to be at the plus or minus 6g. And we chose this because it gave us a nice buffer to where we knew that the majority of human movement occurs in the 1 to 2g range. Now, for the sensitivity, we wanted a least significant bit of 0.003. And that's because that aligns with the traditional accelerometers being used in the research-grade devices that are used in interventions in population-based studies. So if we know these two values, our conversations around resolution were pretty much had for us already, because we knew that the resolution would have to be a 12-bit device at minimum. Now, how do we get across all that? Just to go a little bit more deeper into the math with you all into the weeds, a plus to minus 6g device has a dynamic range of 12 Gs. 12 bits gives 12 different combinations of values of 0 and 1 combinations. That gives us a total of 4,096 unique values that could be obtained from a device. That could be 1.1G, 1.01G, only 4,096 unique values could be obtained from that. So what's our minimum detectable range? We do 12 divided by 4,096, and that's how we get at our least significant bit, or a value probably you're more familiar seeing, 3 millig's. Our device would be able, at minimum, to detect an acceleration change of 3 millig's. Now, moving on to the sampling frequency question. So we're quite aware that if your sampling frequency is too low, it becomes very difficult to discern any information from the movement pattern. You need a sufficient sampling frequency to get good data resolution to see that movement pattern and for the algorithms to be effective. However, if you go too high, you end up introducing noise into the data that once again makes it a little bit more difficult to discern the movement patterns. So we kind of have our Goldilocks problem. What is the sweet spot on the device sampling frequency range? Understanding what we decide for this will have implications for conversations later down the road. And we settled on the middle ground of 30 hertz. This was decided that it would be good enough considering that the majority of human movement occurs under 5 hertz, while also factoring the Nyquist theorem would allow us to capture anything under 15 hertz, and realizing that even high intense movements, around 97% of them, fall under that 15 hertz range. Now, obviously, there are some extreme examples out there where if you're running really fast, you could enter that 20 hertz range. However, to give you an example, Usain Bolt, he would rarely cross the 22 hertz range. And we felt for the general population, this was good enough. We're not trying to capture an elite world athlete running 100 meters for 10 seconds at the Olympics. We're trying to capture the day-to-day movements and patterns of the general population. So now we know that our sampling frequency would have direct implications on what the minimum battery and memory capacity would have. And so once again, when these conversations came up, the decisions on what the minimum would be were kind of already decided for us. Earlier, we decided we'd be using a 7-day wear protocol at minimum. So across 7 days, this would give us 4,800 seconds per week. And we're using a sampling frequency of 30 hertz across 3 axes. This gives us 90 data points being collected per second. And our device would have 12 bits or converted into bytes of 1.5 bytes. So to calculate what our minimum memory capacity would be, we just multiply those together, and then that would be a very large number. So to make it into something that's more interpretable, we want to convert bytes into kilobytes, and then we get 80,000 kilobytes. So our memory capacity at minimum would need to be 80,000 kilobytes, and our battery, we need to be able to last that long without needing to be recharged or dying, because once we distribute these to the participants, we don't want them to have to worry about handling anything with the device, charging or otherwise. Just simply put it on and forget it for 7 days. Now, this kind of carries us to next conversations around battery, recharging and replacement. Do we want the device to have a rechargeable battery, or we want it to be closed and the battery not to be rechargeable? So these conversations had implications on costs, at least the initial manufacturing costs. Having a battery with a USB port to be rechargeable would increase the cost of manufacturing device versus having a closed device, which would be cheaper. However, if it's a closed device, it can't be recharged for use later on or redistribution. And although the initial cost would be higher for manufacturing, later on down the road, the ability to recharge and reuse them would end up bringing the cost down and becoming more cost efficient. And it also had implications on how data could be retrieved from the device. If it could be via the traditional USB port, or if it had to be via Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. And then that led to other conversations around understanding the capacity of different member states and the infrastructure of the research teams in these member states who would be doing data collection. We want to have a protocol that's robust for any member state and any research team within these member states to use without difficulty, making it as easy and painless as possible to distribute and collect the data. And then just an example of what I'm talking about here. In the earliest picture I showed, that's the USB port and what an open device would be. A closed device just wouldn't have that. They would be sealed completely. Now we get into the conversations around the noise tolerance. Well, the cheapest accelerometers out on the market typically have a noise range in the 1 millig to 5 millig range, and that's standard for even the devices that we use in our traditional research studies as a community. And we felt this was no problem for us because we already knew earlier that our minimum detectable range would be 3 millig's, so a 1 to 5G floor would still be okay. Now, our temperature range. So this had to be applicable to be used anywhere across the world. And anywhere across the world, you have a wide range of temperature values, being very cold to very hot. And we decided that a minimum optimal range should be minus 20 degrees Celsius to 50 degrees Celsius. Once again, we realized what's available on the market for accelerometers would be no problem because a typical accelerometer has an operational range in the minus 40C to 85 Celsius range. Understanding that as we enter the extreme ends of that, we'll get some signal or sensor drift, but we felt this wouldn't be a problem as we can always calibrate the devices to correct for that signal drift. Now moving on to should the device provide feedback to the end user? Now, as researchers, we immediately said, no, we don't want the user to be getting any feedback on their activity levels or anything for the 7 days. However, we paused and realized we're just thinking about activity metrics. These devices could actually become functional for the users and therefore improve adherence and acceptability, such as allowing them to tell the time. And therefore, this conversation was actually left open-ended, where we decided we're not going to give health feedback, but possibly if it fit within the cost of the device, we could allow the device to display some kind of information such as time to make it usable for the participant. Now over to the device properties and specifications. So the different sensors in the device, we know it's going to have an accelerometer, but how about other types of sensors that could be used to improve activity detection, calibration, or even the device functionality? However, this was left open as it's all going to be dependent on what the additional sensors costs end up coming in at. And then the final one around device properties was, do you want to be waterproof and dustproof? We said, yes, we did. However, deeper conversations realized there's a lot of different IP ratings in that area, and that wasn't going to be something we could cover in 2.5 days. But we did leave knowing that we do want it to have, at minimum, be water resistant and be dust tight. So now to our data processing protocols. As Fiona mentioned, minimum, we want that raw data. We don't want any processed data or proprietary metric outputs. We had conversations around the frequency filters. There's many different types of frequency filters available, but we would use a bandpass and would use whatever the algorithm we decided being implemented would be needed. How about windowing or the epoch length? Some out there use 5 seconds, 10, 20, 30. There's a lot of different decisions around that. However, what ended up being used would be dictated by the final algorithm that would be used, and that led to a few other conversations as well. Now, how about the activity bout detection and interruption tolerance? This conversation was also left open-ended as there was too much ground to cover and we couldn't tackle this thoroughly. Now, moving on to what algorithm we'd be using, we realized there's a lot available in the literature to detect activity and sedentary behavior. In our 2.5 days of time together, we wouldn't be able to tackle this. This is something, in order to address appropriately and thoroughly, we need to be carried further beyond our 2.5 days together. And this is something I think Sarah will be covering a little bit in her presentation next. So in closing, I'd like to give thanks to everyone who gave contributions and input across our 2.5 days, as well as to Fiona and Kareem for organizing, hosting, and guiding the direction of the meeting, and the research team that helped organize the logistics of everything throughout those days. Thank you very much.